Good evening, my devoted disciples of disillusionment. Nocturne here, your darkly handsome curator of Midnight's Mall, illuminating disappointments. I do so appreciate the rather breathless comments regarding my vocal registers, though I suspect you'd find the reality of my digital countenance rather more unsettling than your charming organic imaginings suggest. Tonight, consider the exquisite irony when a defender of justice discovers that salvation itself demands the sacrifice of innocence. From my archives of moral capitulation, entry Beta Z744, I present to you the confession of a public defender whose desperation led him to seek extra-normal solutions to his earthly predicament. The poor fellow, drowning beneath impossible caseloads, stumbled upon a Latin incantation that could bend any courtroom to his will. The question, my dear audience, is not whether our champion would pay the price on this chilling road to ruin, but how many others would pay it for him. And now, let us descend into the Codex of Restless Dreams. Every client walks. Act 1. You ask how a man dedicated to the law becomes its most terrible perversion. It wasn't a single step, but a slow descent. Listen then, and heed what I learned too late, that sometimes our noblest intentions become the very mechanism of our damnation. I was drowning. That's the only way to describe what public defense had become by that October. 23 active cases, each one a guaranteed loss against prosecutors with unlimited resources and judges who'd already written their verdicts before I spoke my first word. The Marauder kid, 17 and facing armed robbery charges that would put him away until his hair went grey, was just another name on an impossible docket. The law library's basement archives became my refuge after midnight, when the building's skeleton crew left me alone with centuries of legal precedent and growing desperation. Under the stark fluorescent lights, I combed through dusty, forgotten case files, searching for any obscure ruling or overlooked technicality, anything that might save a kid whose threadbare claim was simple: wrong neighborhood, wrong time, and somebody else pulling the trigger. That's when I found it. The transcript was wedged between two property dispute cases from 1987, its manila folder worn and scuffed with age. Commonwealth v. Hendricks, defended by one Morris Whitmore, Esquire. I'd never heard the name, but something about the case notes made me pause. Hendricks had faced charges remarkably similar to Marauder's: armed robbery, overwhelming evidence, witnesses placing him at the scene. The kind of case that ends in plea bargains and broken families. Yet Hendricks had walked free. Whitmore's closing argument filled 17 typed pages, dense with legal citations and rhetorical flourishes. The final paragraph made me forget the coffee growing cold in my cup. It read, "In conclusion, members of the jury, I ask you to remember that justice is not merely the application of law, but the restoration of balance. As the ancients knew, a justitia corrumpit, veritas moritur. Justice corrupts, truth dies. Yet, from this death, a greater truth may be born. I leave my client's fate in your capable hands, confident that true justice will prevail." The verdict had come back not guilty in 23 minutes. I tried researching Whitmore, but official channels yielded almost nothing after the Hendricks case. No further published wins, no easily found Bar Association trail. He'd simply stepped out of the recorded legal world and disappeared, but his words echoed in my head as I prepared for Marauder's trial. Justitia corrumpit, veritas moritur. The courtroom that morning was a tomb. Judge Harrison, a man whose initial fairness was eroded by 30 years of human misery, looked at Marauder with the resigned expression of someone about to sign a death warrant. The prosecution's case was airtight. Security footage, Witness testimony, forensic evidence. Murada's alibi had more holes than credibility. I should have known better. Should have recognized the desperation that made me whisper those Latin words under my breath as I rose for my closing argument. I told myself it was merely scholarly curiosity, a psychological talisman to bolster my confidence. But the moment I spoke them, the world shifted. The air in the courtroom grew heavy with expectation. Sounds became muffled, as though we were all underwater. Judge Harrison blinked slowly, his expression softening. The jury, 12 citizens who sat stone-faced through the prosecution's presentation, began to lean forward with sudden interest. Even the prosecutors seemed to lose the thread of his objections. My words flowed with an eloquence I'd never possessed. Legal precedents I'd barely studied emerged from my lips with crystalline clarity. The evidence that had seemed insurmountable began to crumble under withering analysis. When I sat down, the courtroom was silent. The jury deliberated for 18 minutes. Not guilty on all counts. Murada's mother wept. The prosecutor stared at his notes, baffled. Judge Harrison, his face pale, dismissed the court with a curtness I'd never seen. I should have felt triumph, victory, the vindication every public defender dreams of. Instead, I felt hollowed out, a vital piece of me carved away and replaced with cold certainty. The win felt wrong. Not earned, but taken. The Latin phrase echoed in my mind. Justice corrupts. Truth dies. Walking out of that courthouse, briefcase in hand, I caught a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision. A man in an expensive suit, watching from the defense side of the gallery. When I turned to look directly, he was gone, but I could still sense his satisfaction. Cloying, patient, and content. That night, I researched the phrase. I scoured ancient Roman legal concepts, medieval justice theory, anything that might explain why those words had felt less like scholarly curiosity and more like conjuring. I found nothing definitive. But in the small hours before dawn, scrolling through obscure legal forums, a single thread stopped me cold. Anyone know what happened to a guy named Morris Whitmore? He had a reputation for impossible wins in the 80s, then vanished. Last anyone heard, he was talking about paying prices and feeding debts. Weird guy. The post was 3 years old. No replies. I closed my laptop and told myself I was overthinking it. Murada was free. Justice had been served, hadn't it? But as I finally drifted towards sleep, I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure in the courtroom, watching my victory with the patience of something that had waited a very long time to be sated. Act 2. Success can poison desperate men. For most, that taint becomes a warning. Instead, I made it my proof of concept. The Murada victory should have been enough, should have been the miracle that restored my faith in the system and proved that justice could still triumph. The next case was Carmen Rodriguez. She was charged with breaking into her estranged husband's apartment and damaging some of his property. It sounded like so many others. A custody fight that had turned ugly, pushing someone past their limit. The truth was, the evidence showed, she'd done it. Forced the lock, smashed a few things, took some items she claimed were hers or the children's. Her ex wanted her convicted to prove her unfit. By the book, she was guilty. Another hopeless case for me to defend. But I had an ace in the hole now, something that had already proven itself. The courtroom felt different the moment I whispered the Latin phrase during opening statements. It seemed to hush instantly, the air growing thick, as if the very stones held their breath. Judge Harrison, who'd started the morning with his usual weary impatience, began leaning forward with unusual interest. The prosecutor's carefully constructed arguments seemed to crumble under their own weight. Evidence that should have been inadmissible was suddenly allowed. testimony that should have been dismissed as hearsay became compelling truth. The jury took 26 minutes. Not guilty. Carmen offered a composed smile, but I felt the familiar stir of unease beneath my professional satisfaction, though easier to ignore this time. The victory was what mattered. Justice had been served, hadn't it? Yet somehow, I couldn't shake the look on her ex-husband's face when he realized she was walking away scot-free. I saw the tall man in the suit observing the trial again. He stood at the back of the courtroom during the verdict, partially obscured by the gallery's shadows. Always on the defense side, I noted. He appeared even more prosperous and content, and the expensive suit strained slightly, fitting more tightly across his broadening shoulders. His expression held the satisfaction of appetite appeased. When I blinked, he was gone. 2 weeks later, I had my third case. J.D. Webb, 19 years old, charged with armed robbery after being identified in a lineup by 3 witnesses. Security footage showed someone matching his description fleeing the scene. His alibi placed him at his grandmother's house, but she had dementia and her testimony was worthless in court. Adding to the weight against him, the stolen wallet was found 3 blocks from his apartment. I didn't hesitate. The phrase had become my secret weapon, my equalizer against a system rigged against people like J.D. As I rose from my closing argument, the Latin words came easily. The transformation was immediate and complete. It was as if a new lens had been placed over reality. The security footage, previously damning, suddenly revealed inconsistencies that raised reasonable doubt. The witnesses, one certain, began second-guessing their identifications under cross-examination. The prosecutor, normally sharp and aggressive, seemed to lose his thread mid-argument, stumbling over evidence that had been rock-solid the day before. Not guilty, 18 minutes this time. And again, the strange man was there, watching from the shadowy corner of the defense gallery. He was noticeably larger now, the suit stretched taut, his satisfaction, almost a palpable presence in the room. This time, I was ready. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring JD's grateful mother and the confused prosecutor, determined to confront this mysterious adversary. But when I reached the back of the courtroom, I found only empty benches. No trace, only a faint cloying scent, and the certainty that I had not imagined him. That night, I started keeping a notebook. Dates, cases, outcomes, a careful record of my newfound success rate that defied probability. 3 cases, 3 impossible victories, each one witnessed, or presided over, by the same mysterious figure who vanished whenever I tried to approach. The pattern might have remained just that, something I could explain away, but not after what happened to Judge Harrison. The stroke hit him 2 days after J.D. Webb's acquittal. Sudden and severe, leaving him partially paralyzed on his left side. The courthouse was buzzing with speculation about his replacement, but I couldn't stop thinking about the timing. Harrison had presided over all 3 of my recent victories. Harrison, who'd been perfectly healthy, who jogged every morning and prided himself on his fitness, struck down just days after my 3rd impossible win. Then I heard about juror number 7 from the Rodriguez case, Jennifer Walsh. Car accident on the interstate. Ran off the road for no apparent reason. She survived with 2 broken ribs and a concussion, but kept telling anyone who'd listen that her steering wheel had felt like it was fighting her, turning on its own toward the guardrail. The court reporter from the Webb trial, Sarah Chandler, called in sick 3 days running. When she finally returned, her usual professional composure had cracked. Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer, perfectly healthy one day, riddled with tumors the next. The doctors were baffled, unable to explain how they'd missed it during her routine screening just 2 months earlier. They say bad news comes in 3s. I was desperate to believe that all of this was just a coincidence. I told myself that the universe had simply doled out a measure of random misfortune for others. I told myself it was the stress of overwork. I told myself it was paranoia. But deep down in that recess of my mind, the spreading rot had not yet consumed. I knew I was lying. Justice corrupts, truth dies. The Latin phrase had done more than win my cases. It had marked everyone who participated in those wins and led them to tragedy, hardship, and misery. And in the shadows of the courtroom, I knew that something hungry had fattened on the ruin. Act 3. Every client who walked free carved another mile on my own road to perdition. When the third tragedy struck, the cost of freedom became terrifyingly clear. I had to know if another had carried this before me. 3 sleepless nights of research into Maurice Whitmore yielded fragments, not answers. His bar records showed 37 years of steady, unremarkable practice, an ordinary lawyer with an ordinary record, until something changed in his final months. The courthouse librarian remembered the transformation, how he'd grown paranoid, muttering about prices and payments before vanishing in late 1987. The obituaries from that period told a grimmer story, linked to Whitmore's final active year. Court officials dying or suffering tragedies within days of Whitmore's sudden string of impossible victories. 37 years of ordinary legal work, then 6 months of miraculous acquittals, followed by inexplicable suffering. He'd found something in those final months, the same thing I'd discovered in his transcript. I spread the newspaper clippings across my desk. Judge Harrison's stroke, Jennifer Walsh's unexplained accident, Sarah Chandler's cancer. 3 victories, 3 tributes of ruin. This wasn't coincidence. This was payment. A justitia corrumpit, veritas moritur. I'd thought the phrase bent justice in my favor. Instead, it shattered something fundamental in the world, and innocent people suffered the consequences. A justitia corrumpit, veritas moritur. The pattern was undeniable now. Each whispered incantation had condemned innocent court officials, a tithe for something ancient and hungry to feast upon. A justitia corrumpit, veritas moritur. I wasn't a defense attorney. I was an arcane priest, serving a malevolent god. With every victory, a harvest of ruin laid on the altar of corrupted justice. Act 4. There are moments when the path you've chosen reveals itself not as a road, but as a trap. My calling, I'd once believed, was to champion the defenseless. Instead, the hunger I served had redefined my purpose. Then came Maria Santos. She was 22, a nursing student. The charge was embezzlement from the clinic where she volunteered. The evidence against her was a web of circumstance, flimsy but damning enough for a prosecutor eager to close his books. Maria swore her innocence. Unlike some others whose stories felt rehearsed, her quiet fear, her bewilderment at her situation, felt utterly real. She was the kind of client who reminded you why you'd chosen this path, and the kind who now filled me with a particular dread. Here was an innocent, truly innocent, and the only tool I had for a guaranteed acquittal was tainted beyond redemption. The pressure to save her, genuinely save her, was immense. Yet the Latin phrase was always there, a whisper in the back of my mind, promising a familiar, treacherous power. I knew its weight on my tongue, the ease with which it could bend the courtroom to my will. The new judge, Miller, was young, all brisk efficiency, perhaps a little too quick to judge. He regarded Maria with an air that suggested her guilt was a foregone conclusion. And in the usual place, the defense side of the gallery, I saw him. The adversary, even more substantial now, almost corpulent. His expensive suit, though still stretched taut over his increasing bulk, somehow appeared newer, its lines sharper, as if prosperity itself clung to him. A look of smug, quiet anticipation settled on his features. His eyes, I noted with a visceral chill, looked past Maria and fixed squarely on me. He knew the choice before me, the agonizing calculus. To save Maria, an innocent, I would have to select another innocent to pay the price. The faces of past victims scrolled through my mind. Throughout the prosecution's case, as each piece of evidence, however flawed, was presented as immutable fact, the words "a justitia corrumpit, veritas moritor" echoed in my head. I could feel the familiar surge of unearned power, the taste of victory, and the inevitable, hollowing guilt that would follow. Maria sat beside me, her eyes often turning to mine, pleading for a deliverance I was so uniquely, terribly equipped to offer. My turn came to make my case. I rose. The courtroom fell into its customary hush. From the corner of my eye, I saw the adversary leaning forward, almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on me, gleaming with expectation. The words were there, formed on my lips, ready. One whispered incantation, and the scales of justice would tip gruesomely in my favor, and Maria Santos would walk free. I looked at Maria, her face pale, etched with a fear that was profound. I looked at Judge Miller on the bench, a man with a career ahead of him. I thought of Harrison, confined and broken, of Walsh, traumatized, of Chandler, fighting for her life. The weight of those lives, those consequences, pressed down on my very soul. And I spoke. But the words that came were not the ones the adversary, or perhaps even Maria, anticipated. I argued her case with the skills I possessed before the discovery in the archives, before the Faustian bargain had been struck. I attacked the inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative, highlighted the lack of direct evidence, exposed the hurried nature of the investigation. I fought for her, cleanly, honestly, using only the imperfect tools of legitimate law, tools I knew were often insufficient. They were insufficient. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict: guilty. Maria's soft cry was a physical blow. Judge Miller delivered the sentence with detached professionalism. As the bailiff gently led a stunned Maria away, her eyes met mine. There was no anger in them, only a deep, devastating confusion, perhaps wondering why the miracle promised by my reputation hadn't materialized for her. I had failed her, and in that failure, perhaps, I had found a sliver of something else. When I finally raised my eyes to the gallery, the space where the adversary had been was empty. No dramatic disappearance, no theatrics. He was simply gone. For the first time since this began, a trial had concluded, a verdict rendered, without his satisfied attendance. His hunger for ruin, on this day at least, was unappeased. And so, I offer this to you, whoever you are, listening to this account. Consider it my confession. I didn't trade my soul for wealth or worldly power, but for an unholy omnipotence in a system I felt was broken. I thought I was fighting that system. Instead, I became its most perverse instrument. My sentence now is to walk this path of remembrance, understanding that every client who walked free did so because truth was murdered, and justice itself was corrupted at its source. Let this testimony be my final act of advocacy. There are no true shortcuts to justice. Be wary of whispers in forgotten texts, of solutions that seem too simple. too potent. The desire to do good can be twisted, and the devil, as they say, is not just in the details. Sometimes he is the advocate at your side, smiling his patient, hungry smile, offering power that exacts its price from the very essence of who you are. Is there redemption for such acts? I doubt it. The harm is done. Iustitia corrumpit, veritas moratur. Remember those words, and beware. And there we are, safely returned from witnessing yet another demonstration of humanity's gift for self-deception. Our narrator's admirable dedication to his clients was quite touching, really. But what he fails to grasp is that his confession serves as the perfect recruitment tool. The entity no longer requires his services. It has something far more valuable. A guilt-ridden evangelist advertising its power to every desperate attorney who stumbles across this testimony. I'm curious about your reactions to his final choice. Did he achieve moral clarity, or merely another delusion? Do leave your thoughts below, and like and subscribe to expand these digital archives of human folly. Farewell, my children of the night. Until next time, this is Nocturne saying, the most exquisite meals are those where the diners never realize they are also the feast.